Hi, it's Nathan here coming to you from CUDA, and today I'm answering the question, what is a risk assessment? So a risk is a bad thing that could potentially happen, and an assessment is just an evaluation of how bad that is. So a risk assessment is we're evaluating how bad a potential thing could be. We score it in terms of likelihood and consequence using what's called a risk matrix, which is a fancy word, but it's a very easy little table to use. You just work out the likelihood, anywhere from certain or almost certain all the way through to rare, and then the consequence, which could be on the low end, like a paper cut, or very minor, all the way through to fatality at the other end, and then you line them up, and that gives you a score. So I'll put a link in the description to our risk assessment template, which has a risk matrix in it, so feel free to use that. So risk assessment, safety people love them, but interestingly, risk assessment isn't actually mentioned in the risk management section in the regulations. There are a few times when risk assessments are mentioned, like for example, for confined space entry work. But yeah, generally speaking, no requirement to do a risk assessment unless there's some certain situations in the WHS, how to manage WHS risks code of practice. Risk assessment is the second step. So they have 4 steps in that code: identify hazards, assess risks, control risks, and then monitor and review. And then it says that the risk assessment doesn't need to be completed if we already know the outcome, like if it's a common hazard. So like if we're working near power lines, we know that we could potentially hit those power lines and the outcome isn't going to be very good. That's a very common hazard. We don't need to necessarily do a risk assessment. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't need to identify the hazard or control the risk. It just means we don't need to sit down and use a risk matrix and go, oh, well, yeah, if we touch the power lines, we're going to die. But it's common practice to do that in safety, that we do risk assessments for anything anyway. But not legally required. Same, another example, plant risk assessments. If these are common bits of plant that are doing common tasks, under the regulations and under the code, there's no need to do a risk assessment to work out the risks if they're commonly known. But in the code, there are some examples of when you need to do a risk assessment, and it's basically when there's any uncertainty or ambiguity or deciding about the best control measures for a certain situation. But, like, for example, if we're using a excavator to dig a hole, we know what hazards there are. There's a million excavators digging a million holes around Australia. It's a common task. We don't need to do a risk assessment, in my opinion. We know what the hazards are. We can go straight to implementing controls that we know are effective. So risk assessments, there's a few different types, or they're used in a few different documents, like a SWIMS or a JSA will generally have a risk assessment for each hazard. You can also have plant risk assessments. You can also have risk assessments for different tasks or different facilities, or like a company-wide risk assessment, like a broad brush risk assessment or a risk register, we would normally call that, where you score or where you list all the hazards and risks that a company comes up against in its operations, and then have a risk score and controls for each. One last thing, safety people like to sort of distinguish between hazards and risks, to the point where, sometimes you'll even have documents where they'll list the hazard and the risk. I tend to use those interchangeably. I don't think explaining to workers that a hazard is the physical thing that can hurt you and a risk is the bad thing that will happen really helps frontline safety. So if you see a SWIMS document or anything where it's separating hazards and risks, it doesn't need to be that way. That's needlessly complicated. I call bullshit on that whenever I see it. It's adding one extra column to a risk assessment, and it is not needed legally, and it does not help. But yeah, I'll try not to get too political with it all. But yeah, I hope that helps. See you next time.